Today's topic is ethical design insofar as regards assessing the risks and benefits of clinical research. And what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time at the beginning sort of developing the party line, as it were, as to an account of assessing risks and benefits that most people who talk about this would agree is plausible. And the way, and to do that by offering a little history as to how thinking about assessing risks and benefits has evolved, then mention some recent criticisms of the notion of clinical equipoise, which is the traditionally very important notion in designing clinical research ethically, and then get to some cases. And I hope all along we can talk to one another, particularly when we get to the cases. There should be some interesting discussion. So the risk-benefit ratio, assessing risks and benefits, one of the important aspects of research ethics. I would argue potentially, once you get past scientific value and scientific validity of the study, risks and benefits arguably might be the most important ethical issue when it comes to designing clinical research. And there's a lot of, it seems to me, lack of clarity in much of the language that we use about what constitutes a favorable risk-benefit ratio. When is a risk-benefit ratio, quote-unquote, reasonable? There's not a lot of direction, for instance, in the Common Rule, in the Belmont Report, as to how one goes about deciding that. Now, the whole issue of risks and benefits and research subjects really came to the forefront back in the 60s. Back in the 60s and early 70s, Henry Beecher published his paper in the New England Journal detailing numerous abuses of research subjects by clinical investigators. Tuskegee revelation in 1972 in the New York Times. This raised the issue of the protection of research subjects in the public consciousness to an enormous degree. And these questions were raised. I mean, what do investigators owe participants? What do they owe society? How can those interests be reconciled? How should we design clinical research so that both interests are sufficiently protected? And clinical investigators, I mean, the response of the investigator community at this time was very interesting. And very, I think, off-putting, many of us would say, from our present perspective, from our present sensibility. I mean, people like Walsh McDermott, one of the grand old men of the clinical investigator community, professor of infectious disease at Cornell, had done pioneering work in the use of newly invented antibiotics back in the 40s and 50s. What does he say? He sort of makes a case, well, there have been some abuses of research participants, and maybe we can do better when it comes to protecting research participants, but there is no escape from the fact that if the future good of society is to be served, sometimes research participants are going to have to be sacrificed for the good of society. Sometimes when the needs of society come in head-on conflict with the rights of an individual, someone has to play God. And who better to play God than us, the clinical investigators. We have the knowledge, we have the experience, we have the perspective. We can make these judgments as to when, how to balance the interests of research participants and of society in regard to the knowledge to be gained. You need to trust us. I mean, that's basically the message that many, and I think McDermott spoke for many in the clinical investigator community, how they responded to all this. Now, of course, that wasn't the way the discussion evolved. Certainly not among the bioethics community. And when principles for designing clinical research were eventually articulated, as they were in the Common Rule, the predecessors to the Common Rule were published in 1981. And the way the issue of risk is articulated is that they ought to be reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits, if any, and to the importance of the knowledge anticipated. Now, you might say to yourself, does that not still leave open the sort of Walsh-McDermott approach? You know, yes, we need to consider benefits to society, but the importance of the knowledge anticipated is a critical issue here, and perhaps sometimes the interests of research participants might be in second place to the importance of knowledge coming to society. Now, if you look at the Belmont Report, from which the common rule issued, you get a little bit of reassurance, because the Belmont Report says, yes, we need to balance these various elements, the welfare of society, the welfare of research participants, and usually the risks and benefits affecting the immediate research subject will carry special weight. So if you're going to put a research participant at risk, I mean, that needs to be balanced against benefit, not just to society, but to the research participant. I mean, we need to consider the interests of the research participant here. But even the Belmont Report kind of leaves it open. On the other hand, interests other than those of the subject may on some occasions be sufficient by themselves to justify the risks involved in the research, so long as the subject's rights have been protected. Well, what does it mean to protect the rights of the subject? This is all still somewhat vague. This still leaves open, it seems to me, a McDermottian take on all this, if one wanted to go in that direction. So it's at this point, I think, that the issue of clinical equipoise comes to the fore. And this is simply, these are questions, I think, that would occur to you. If you look at the common rule, you look at the Belmont Report, there are questions that are unanswered. What kinds of risks are reasonable? It's unclear. If the participants in research are going to get benefits, if they're not going to get benefits, and what about the importance of the knowledge to society? How does that balance against risk to participants themselves? These are all unanswered questions at this point. So clinical equipoise becomes a way of thinking about this. And it's invented by a lawyer, a professor of law at Harvard in 1974, who argues that an investigator can ethically enroll a subject in a research study if in that investigator's mind there's uncertainty as to the relative merits of the treatment arms. So there's genuine uncertainty that one treatment arm is better than another. In that case, it's ethical to enroll a subject. Now that account, so the notion of clinical equipoise, there's this balance, and once you look at a treatment option A, treatment option B, how effective, how much clinical benefit is there, and you say to yourself, well, I'm not sure, maybe it's 50-50, hopefully it's 50-50, and if it's 50-50, well then randomly assigning somebody to A or B is okay, that's legitimate. Very quickly, there are critiques of that way of thinking about it. I mean, it seems very subjective. So the individual investigator happens to have equipoise, but what if other people don't have equipoise? What do you do then? And so Friedman, a little bit later, makes the innovation of suggesting that the equipoise does not need to be in the mind of the individual investigator, but instead needs to be in the clinical community. So there's a community of experts, and there's a consensus that between treatment A and treatment B, there's uncertainty as to which is better. And if that's the case, well, then it's okay to enroll somebody in a research study. And that's probably the orthodox account of clinical equipoise that has pretty much remained in currency since the 80s. That leads us to what I would say is probably the recent consensus, Research is indeed aimed at future societal welfare. I mean, nobody denies that. Nobody denies that it's not just about individual research participants. But while we're after societal welfare, we need to observe constraints in our treatment of participants. And the way to think about those constraints when it comes to risks and benefits is clinical equipoise. I mean, that's kind of the guiding paradigm, if you will. Now, there have been some, so this is just a statement of Friedman's sort of account of this, absence of consensus in the expert community. The trial must be designed to expect a disturbance of clinical equipoise. So you're doing the trial so that you can decide whether one really is better than the other, given uncertainty at the outset. Now, there have been some developments of the notion of clinical equipoise. It's been argued that, in fact, the expert consensus is not really the important thing. I mean, what if the expert consensus is completely off base? You know, certainly we're all aware of situations where that's been the case. Objective scientific knowledge should be where the equipoise is. I mean, if you look at, you know, no matter what people think, if you can make an objective scientific case that there's uncertainty, that's the important locus for equipoise. And probably this middle view here is probably, I would say, where most people have come to sort of rest. And that is, the uncertainty doesn't need to be 50-50. It only needs to be such that the metaphorical confidence intervals of the hunches regarding the two treatments overlap. So, I mean, you may have a preliminary indication that, you know, treatment A is much better than treatment B. But you have a very limited data set, perhaps, as to the results from treatment A. So your confidence intervals are very wide. And treatment B, which has been in use for a long time, it's not as good as treatment A seems to be. But you have a lot of knowledge about that, and your confidence intervals for that one are fairly narrow. Well, if the wide confidence intervals for treatment A still overlap with treatment B, then it's okay to do the study. Because you don't know for sure that treatment A really is better, even though you think it's better. So that I think is probably where most people are when it comes to how we should think about equipoise in designing trials. So this seems like an attractive way to think about risks and benefits. It appeals to our sensibilities as clinicians. A lot of medical research is conducted by physicians, and you know, our sort of outlook as physicians is we want the best thing for our patient, and we don't want our patient to have something less than the standard of care. And if you're on the clinical equipoise page, you're generally going to be saying to yourself, my patient's going to be getting, you know, the standard of care is consistent with both treatment A and treatment B. So that's a comforting way of looking at it for a clinician. And so if you're a clinician and also a researcher, you can sort of fit your sensibilities there together a bit. But there's some difficulties with equipoise. We don't always abide by it. I mean, we don't always, you know, placebo-controlled trials of new medications for depression would be an example. I mean, there are known treatments for depression, yet we want to argue that for placebo controls. But if you do a placebo-controlled trial, it's much easier to show that a new treatment actually has an effect. And we don't feel that uncomfortable doing that for something like depression. There's also the question is, when ought we to defer to opinion in the expert community? You know, if you put the locus of equipoise in objective scientific knowledge, maybe you get around that a little bit. The presence or absence of equipoise is not always a reliable guide as to when a trial is needed. I mean, we all can think of cases where that's true, right? I mean, there's no equipoise when the clinical community is persuaded that one way of going about things is the right way, but the clinical community can be wrong. And you know, the orthopedic community and arthroscopic surgery for OA of the knee it was an example of that. The trial was nevertheless done, and even though there was no equipoise, important new knowledge came from that trial. And when equipoise, goes away, say in the course of a trial, does that mean the trial ought to be stopped? The trial of letrozole for preventing the recurrence of breast cancer was such a situation in which the trial was stopped early because it looked so good, and people argued later that, sure, you've shown progression-free survival, but the trial was designed to go for overall survival, and you don't have enough data to show that overall survival is any better. And now we're never going to know. So that was this trial was stopped, and there were powerful arguments that it shouldn't have been stopped afterwards. And then finally, equipoise doesn't help us with certain kinds of trial types. For instance, challenge trials in healthy volunteers, studies of basic science when you simply want to understand physiology better. What kinds of risks should you subject participants in those kinds of trials to? Equipoise doesn't really give us much guidance for that. Any more sort of fundamental criticism of equipoise would be, equipoise is sort of a clinical kind of approach to research, but research is not clinical medicine. These are conceptually two different activities. If you're a researcher, you're after new knowledge. You're not sort of, your gaze is not that of taking, doing the best thing I can for you, the individual patient. So there's a mismatch between equipoise and research as an activity. So, faced with these criticisms, those who like equipoise have tried to sort of save it, as it were. So one approach is to say, well, yes, equipoise only applies to therapeutic research. And if you're doing therapeutic research and you're comparing treatments, well, then equipoise is the way you should go. But if you're not, if you're doing non-therapeutic research, well, then you simply have to minimize risks as best you can and make sure that the risks you're subjecting people to are reasonable. And once again, you might ask, well, what does that mean? What is reasonable? The other approach, the recent sort of response to equipoise has been to wish to jettison it, to focus on the fact that research and medicine are two different things. Therefore, equipoise doesn't apply. All we really can do is assess risks. And you basically, when you're thinking about the risks you're going to subject your participants to, what you do is you ask yourself, are they minimized? If they exceed the potential for clinical benefit, are the net risks to the participants sufficiently low and justified for the potential for important new knowledge? Now that's a very interesting way to think about it to me, because it seems to me that if you take this approach, which certain in the bioethics community are rather vociferously arguing for right now, perhaps I would ask the question, have you gone back to Walsh-McDermott? If you're simply saying, are the risks to the participants sufficiently low and justified for the potential for important knowledge, might you not conclude in a given case that this knowledge is so important that, I'm going to subject, you, research participant, to a really, really, really horrible risk because it's worth it, and I can play God. Clinical equipoise, for its conceptual difficulties, has been a kind of protection to research participants in our thinking about the design of research, that if we give it away, I think one could argue that we need to come up with something else. That simply saying, are the risks sufficiently low and justified for the potential for important new knowledge? I mean, that may not be enough of the right question to ask, or not the only question that ought to be asked. Any comments or thoughts about this so far? Does this all ring a bell? I mean, do you all sort of have clinical equipoise in the back of your head?
You could talk some about like a specific study that sort of brings all together, because
We're going to do that.
the word risks bothers me a little bit because ambiguous word. So, for example, going to the osteoarthritis trial. So, is there a risk to randomizing a patient to not get surgery to the knee? It seems like a strange concept. There's risk that if the procedure is ineffective, that there would be more risk to getting the procedure done. So
I think it's even worse than that. I mean, you're randomizing, in that study, you're randomizing somebody to sham surgery. And so basically you're randomizing somebody to the risk of undergoing, manipulation of their limb for no clinical benefit whatsoever. And you're saying that's okay.
Well, I guess then where in all of this does the sort of the patient's consent come into play? Because you can imagine for a lot of clinical research, patients are going to say, this sounds like an important question for society, but I don't want to be part of it. There's going to be a lot of people who are driven by altruistic motivations that are going to...
Consent is very important. And the argument of the people who make this kind of case, that the clinical equipoise is unnecessary, what does the work in their formulation in place of clinical equipoise is the notion of consent. And basically they're going to say, this question, are the net risks sufficiently low and justified for the potential for important knowledge? If you, the research participant, understand properly and you want to make this leap into the unknown to seek for knowledge and are willing to do that, well then your rights are not being violated, you are not being exploited, and even a pretty darn high risk is ethically acceptable. That's what these guys are going to say.
The problem is that we don't always even know what the risks are, the experts, and so how can the study subject appreciate the risks?
The advocates of clinical equipoise would say that's not good enough. They would say consent cannot do all that work. Even if people consent, there are things that we ought not to do to research participants in the name of new knowledge. I mean, the argument would be joined at that point.
But I wonder then, can't you just go back up to that first line and say that the knowledge you're looking to get is just not that important? That's the reason that it's not that good.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think you could make that argument, and it would be a very important argument.
Because it seems like in clinical research we're willing to tolerate a huge amount of risk. People will undergo an unnecessary heart catheterization for the purpose of a research study, and I'm sure there are people who have died from unnecessary heart catheterization. So I mean, we're certainly willing to sacrifice life and limb.
I think you could probably develop some generalizations as to situations in when we're generally willing to tolerate less risk and other situations in which we tolerate more. We certainly tolerate more for people that are in desperate situations. So if you're doing a trial for glioblastoma, you're going to be much more, and that patient is going to die in 6 months, inevitably under current conditions. And you might tolerate a lot of risk, and that patient might tolerate a lot of risk for a very small chance of clinical benefit. But that equation would look very different for somebody who's not an extremist. And our willingness to tolerate risks for people that have a good outlook, that have a good prognosis, that have a good future, probably ought to be less. I mean, I think we can make generalizations of that sort.
Maybe. I mean, you can make the opposite generalization that with a glioblastoma who have a 6-month survival or a vulnerable population and would probably agree to anything, and that would actually make their consent less valid, and they would need more protections.
Yeah, and people do make that argument that indeed people in extremists are vulnerable and therefore that's an issue. But the counter argument is there's also a logic to being willing to undergo a higher risk but possibly high reward intervention in that situation. I mean, that's not irrational. So should somebody be protected against making a very potentially rational choice? Arguably, no.
Sure, I should know this, but is there a standard way in which IRBs are told to think about these issues, or are they, is this up to the individual IRB or the individual case that's being discussed? Or
I think a lot of it's very individualized. I think, I mean, my own experience, I joined the IRB. I said, I don't really know anything about research ethics. What should I look at? And, whoever appointed me to the committee, the provost of the university said, well, you go read the Belmont Report. And if you read the Belmont Report, you'll be in good shape. And I think, in committee meetings, I mean, the notion of clinical equipoise is kind of implicit. It's not often explicitly stated, but I mean, everybody, you know, looks at these studies and compares what's being done to what the standard of care is. I think there's an implicit sort of regard for equipoise, even though we don't, at least last time I was on the IRB, I mean, it didn't really come up in conversation very much. So, now those that try to preserve equipoise, the attack on the preservation of equipoise is that you can't always really identify clearly therapeutic trials versus non-therapeutic trials. And the clinical criteria set too high a bar for assessing risk, basically. You're not going to let people undergo risks that maybe you should be letting them undergo if clinical equipoise is where you stand. And therefore clinical equipoise, you know, it's a physician perspective, and it just doesn't, it's not right for research. However, if you take this, you do away with clinical equipoise, you know, then do you go back to Walsh-McDermott? I mean, how do you answer these questions about risk? Seems to me you have difficulties if you do away with it too. So, I mean, I think that's sort of where, more or less, where the discussion has been recently with this. And I thought maybe the thing to do, let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll talk about some cases. We'll talk about some actual trials that have been controversial and how this stuff might or might not apply.
Can I ask one question? So do you see any alternatives, you know, to the idea of equipoise besides just consent or that?
I think the most persuasive alternatives I've seen have been attempts to locate a protection for research subjects not in the clinician's perspective, but instead in consider research as a societal activity undertaken for the benefit of, you know, the people in society, and research participants are among those people. And so the basic rights and welfare of participants and future members of society all need to be considered together, and there are going to be constraints on how we deal with the welfare of those in studies. We're not just going to think about the welfare of those that come after. You know, people have sort of taken political theorists like Rawls and others to argue that the basic rights of everybody need to be protected, and that includes research participants. And for that, and you end up with something close to clinical equipoise. You end up with something like saying, you know, the standard of care really should be something that we should not go below for research participants. You end up in a similar place, but you don't, the source of it is not the clinician's perspective per se.
The term standard of care a number of times, though, doesn't that raise the danger of sort of inducing, you know, therapeutic misconception, this idea of you come into this trial and either way you're getting standard of care, don't worry about it, and you know, being part of this trial is no big deal, versus actually this trial is not for your benefit, and you should know that when you're joining that. We expect some degree of altruism in people who are joining trials because we don't want them to think that they're actually getting something.
I agree. You know, research is not clinical medicine, but nevertheless, while research participants do not stand in relation to the investigator in the way that patients stand in relation to their doctor, there is nevertheless some overlap. And yes, there can be a therapeutic misconception in which the two roles are conflated, but there is that overlap, and I don't think the fact that there is the possibility of overconflation means that we ought not to acknowledge that there is a certain amount of overlap there, and we investigators stand in a parental, you know, to some extent caring stance toward research participants, even if it's not the same stance as that of a clinician.
I guess my lot of criticism was used of the term standard of care, which is like a legal standard, which really has no business in research research. I hadn't heard that term used to sort of describe equipoise before, but I wonder if that's something that's actually being done in the literature. People are using the term standard of care as a term used to explain equipoise.
Well, I think the notion that research participants should be, not be getting care or whatever they're getting, it shouldn't be that far below or different from what people would be getting from physicians. I mean, I think it's a fairly common notion. I mean, I can't speak to how often the actual phrase is used, but I think the phrase is used, and I think the idea is definitely there.
Be that one part of the arm, one part of the trial, it's not standard of care, right? I mean, it's so the implication that it needs to be close enough to standard of care.
Yeah, close enough. The confidence intervals. I think that confidence interval idea is a powerful one.
My definition of standard of care is like the care that you provided you wouldn't be convicted of negligence. But if I'm giving you an investigational drug that's never been tested before, almost by definition that can't be standard of care.
I guess that's one of the reasons why they don't do studies where you do standard of care versus something completely different all that often. It's both people get standard of care and one gets something extra. Or maybe that's not really true, but that's been my impression.
I mean, if you're testing an antibiotic for an infection, you're going to test it against another antibiotic. You're not going to test it against placebo. If you're testing a new anti-cancer drug and there is effective treatment for the cancer against which you're testing the new drug, you're not going to test the new cancer drug against an arm that doesn't have the cancer drug that's accepted.
I think I have a more sort of a semantic argument than that. That's what you're saying.
I mean, that's the sense in which I'm implying standard of care is important.
I'd rather not see the word standard of care used to describe equipoise. I'd rather see it as risks and uncertainties.
Well, okay. I guess I don't quite see the difficulty, but maybe you can enlighten me later. So this study is a really interesting one. Maybe you all remember the article in the New York Times back in 2010. But PLX 4032, just to start out, I mean, the treatment of metastatic melanoma, as you all know, fairly recently was very dismal. People generally didn't do very well. There were responses to treatment. There really weren't benefits in terms of survival. So if you had metastatic melanoma, I mean, you had a death sentence. Until PLX 4032 was developed to target the products of the BRAF gene, which when it's mutated, leads to a cascade of cell signaling, which leads to cell proliferation, which in certain melanoma patients is an important mechanism for the way that their cancer proliferates. Actually, a lot of melanoma patients. And so this agent is designed to target that process and is tested in a phase 1 study in 2009. And the results of that study are fairly dramatic. Tumor regression, disease control, definite responses in most of the patients. Very, very different picture than the standard of care for metastatic melanoma as of 2009. So this is a small phase 1 study. It's extended. Some more patients are subjected to the treatment. It's a single arm, but the responsiveness of patients to this agent remain quite dramatic. An overall 70% response rate, people with complete responses, greater than 50% partial responses, quite common. This is big stuff. So the question is, what to do next. So in some cases, patients who were close to death had literally very quickly sort of risen from the dead. I mean, patients had undergone a Lazarus effect from this drug, which had never happened with the other drug. So what should this drug company do? Should they? I mean, this is so dramatic. I mean, can you ethically do an RCT? Can you ethically do a phase 3 trial? And compare this agent to standard of care, dacarbazine, with its horrible. You know, should you decide design a trial with a crossover arm? You know, if people don't respond in a certain period of time. Should you seek accelerated approval based on the data you have from a phase 1 or a phase 2 trial? You know, should you conduct a trial that would give you an endpoint that would be perhaps easier to get to quick, like quality of life? Or, you know, should you do the scientifically rigorous thing, conduct a phase 3 trial, you know, have an overall survival endpoint, you know, go by the book. I mean, the article in the New York Times was dramatic because the reporter surveyed the oncology community, and opinions on this were all over the map. And there were a lot of people who made an argument that accelerated approval of some sort was the way to go. And at the most, if you were going to do further trials, you needed to do have an endpoint of progression-free survivals so that you could design a trial in which people could cross over. A lot of argument that randomization would be unethical, given what, you know, dramatic but still rather preliminary data. Any thoughts?
I guess we don't know about long-term effects.
Correct. I mean, these are short, you know, these are short-term results. I mean, there have been other situations in which preliminary data in phase 1 and phase 2 studies have looked very promising, and then in the phase 3 trial, things revert to not as good. You know, avastatin for breast cancer, it's initially approved by accelerated approval, and then it's pulled because in the phase 3 trial that the company did after the accelerated approval, it didn't pan out. On the other hand, this is really dramatic.
Are you know anything about like newer trial designs, like combined phase 2, phase 3, around any of this and allowing you to get a scientifically acceptable answer
That's a good question.
in a quicker amount of time? I mean, this isn't so much of a risk-benefit for the patient sitting in front of you question for me, because I have a patient, I'm an oncologist and I have a patient's drug is not available. So,
but you might say, I want to call the company and get compassionate use. I want the company to send me some of this drug. I mean, this is what this patient needs.
yeah, but that's not, so, but then you're, I guess, getting into the regulatory stuff. So, if I have a patient in front of me and there's a drug that I think is promising that's not available, that they can only get to do a trial, then the idea of randomizing them seems less problematic.
I want to say that usually, I mean, the regulatory environment would permit compassionate use for somebody who's about to die. of a drug that's in trial, would it not? Well, in the face of a lot of controversy, Roche decided to go ahead and do a phase 3 trial. And they did the trial, and the results were good. They weren't quite as good as the initial data in the phase 1. It was still fairly dramatic. But I think it remains an open question. I mean, was that what they should have done? I mean, should they have done something that would have led to approval sooner rather than later? I think one argument that the New York Times brought out was that in other cases in which things have sort of reverted to the mean and haven't looked as good afterwards, the mechanism wasn't so well established. This was a case where you had all the dials were pointing in the same direction, not just clinical results, but also pathophysiology, the science of it, the basic science of it. I mean, you could, you just knew based on not merely what happened to patients, but the fact that the mechanism made sense. I mean, it all sort of was more compelling than some of the other cases in which that wasn't quite so much the case. So it seems to me that a powerful case could be made that maybe they should have done something that would have led to approval sooner than actually happened. But we can certainly argue. It's certainly good to have the hard endpoint of overall survival. So, how do you, these are the arguments on either side. Can you resolve them? I'm not sure that there's really a clear resolution. I would tend to, I think, be on the accelerated approval side, but you could certainly make the other case. Okay, that's just... So I couldn't resist talking about this study since it happened here. And I think, most of the brouhaha about this study had to do with the consent form, but I think there are questions that we can ask about the way the study was designed that are interesting. So what's the problem? Retinopathy of prematurity, death and neurological impairment are reciprocally related to O2 sat levels in premature infants, very premature infants, 24 to 27 weeks premature.
Sorry, can I ask one other question about, so the previous study, so who paid for the study?
I presume Roche did.
Roche did. So in some ways, they're taking the more conservative route to study the way they do.
I think they're looking toward long-term viability of their drug. Do they want to get preliminary results that, and then is it going to pan out if they do something later? I mean, I guess I can't really speak to that. What's their, if they're looking at it financially, what would be the most logical strategy?
I don't, sorry, I'm so ignorant about this, but so what's the norm for data follow-up on study on the drug after it's approved in a sort of phase 4?
Well, if you get accelerated approval, I mean, that was...
Is that what is required?
I mean, I just sort of put these in there to... So regular approval, you need safety and efficacy. Efficacy is phase 3, and the efficacy generally has to be a hard endpoint. So that's regular approval. Accelerated approval, it's specifically limited to investigational agents for serious and life-threatening diseases. 1992, you can picture HIV was what led to all this, and you can use surrogate endpoints if they're reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. And in 1992, I mean, what was the surrogate endpoint? It was the CD4 count. It was viral load. That was an acceptable endpoint for the FDA rather than prolongation of life of the HIV patient, at least initially. But once you get that accelerated approval, you're expected to conduct a post-approval trial that's going to give you the hard endpoints. So there's this problem with the treatment of premature infants. I mean, how do you decide what O2 sat to keep them at? And it turns out that if you look at large groups of neonatologists taking care of premature infants, I mean, there's a range of O2 sats that you see. And that range is roughly 85 to 95. And the question that the investigators here are asking is there an optimal range that could minimize both complications? And in particular, if you used a lower O2 sat range, might you get rid of retinopathy of prematurity without getting a lot of excess consequences of low O2 sat in the form mainly of neurological problems? So that was sort of the question that they wanted to answer. So how did they decide to answer that question? Basically, they decided to sort of do two studies at once. I mean, one was going to be the O2 sat range study, and they would compare the higher range with the lower range. And the other thing they would do would be to compare an automatic intubation strategy with a permissive intubation strategy. So, maybe some of these babies wouldn't need to be intubated, and therefore we'll try, we'll have an arm in which we just do CPAP, and then they get intubated if they need it. And then in another arm, they'll be automatically intubated and get surfactant. So, I mean, it was sort of an ingenious way of blinding those caring for the infants. They actually doctored the pulse oximeters, so they all sort of looked the same, but the O2 ranges that the infants were getting were actually different. So those taking care of the infants didn't really know which range they were in. And they to me, this is an interesting point. They decided upon a composite endpoint. And the composite endpoint that they came up with was death or retinopathy, or severe retinopathy. Think about that. So what happened? The composite endpoint, both arms statistically looked the same, not statistically different, although there was a trend. However, a result which they had not powered the study to detect, death as an endpoint by itself, ended up being significantly more frequent in the low O2 arm. So the brouhaha really sort of hit 3 years after this was published. And the letter faulted the consent form. And what did the consent form say? The consent form said that your infant is going to get a range of oxygen between 85 and 95, and that is the standard of care. And so the risks to your infant are going to be no more than usual care. And that's, those are really the only risks your infant is going to sustain. And OHRP said that was an inaccurate statement. What do you think?
Yeah, I think this goes back to what I was saying before. That it's an unethical statement because the ethics of this trial are that there was they were doing the study because they thought there was a trade-off between retinopathy and death, and that's something that.
Well, what they knew there was that trade-off.
That's something that people who were consenting should have walked away from. They should have been reassured that I'm getting the standard of the care, so there's actually no risks.
So it wasn't standard of care. So you're agreeing with the OHRP?
I think that the consent form had ethical problems.
Okay. So it wasn't standard of care that they were getting, that the infants were getting.
But I think the standard of care is a legal concept that has to do with whether.
No, I think it's a medical concept too. We have a sense of what patients should get from us for condition, whatever condition they have. And we say to ourselves either, this treatment was adequate or we don't. I mean, yes, this happens, this is in the legal arena, but who makes those judgments? The medical experts review those charts and say, this care was okay, it met standard of care, or it didn't meet standard of care. I mean, I think that's a medical concept too.
I think it's not an ethical concept, and I think that the ethical piece that they should have gotten out of this is we're doing this trial because we believe that there are trade-offs. People should have known that there were these trade-offs, these potential trade-offs.
Any of the rest of you?
You just, is it because it says it's between 85 and 95 standard, rather than saying they'll be randomly or assigned to either low or high within this range that is considered here?
Well, the OHRP simply said that it wasn't this was not standard of care, because standard of care would be an individual decision on a given O2 sat level for an individual premature infant. I mean, an individual clinician would look at that infant, would look at the trade-off, and would say, you know, golly, this is hard, but this is where I want my O2 sat to be. And one can envision that some infants, perhaps, who, you know, could have done without an O2 sat of 95 because their organs were in good shape and they didn't need that higher O2 sat rate. Somebody could have made that judgment, you know, ended up in that 95 range, 91 to 95 range, and perhaps got some retinopathy as a result that they didn't need, that particular infant didn't need to get. And the same thing would be true on the other end, you know. An infant who needed more oxygen because, you know, maybe that infant's lactate was high. Maybe that infant was having organ dysfunction. Maybe that infant really needed that little push into the mid-90s. But that infant was assigned, you know, to the high 80s, and that wasn't good enough for that infant. So that infant, I mean, that, you know, presumably that's the way that the death rate was higher in that low O2 sat group. So even though the range was standard of care in the aggregate for a large group of infants, at the individual level, it wasn't standard of care. I think the OHRP was right about that. And the OHRP does not fault the design of the study at this juncture. Sidney Wolfe, who's you know, rabble-rousers at Public Citizen, he does fault the design of the study. He says infants should never have been subjected to this. The standard of care is clearly superior to what all the infants in this study were subjected to because of the arbitrary assignment to a high O2 sat or a low O2 sat group that was detrimental to the infants compared to standard of care, and this study should not have been done. So that's what Sidney Wolfe says. NIH and the New England Journal vociferously and vehemently defend this study, argue that this was standard of care. The consent form was correct. There was not an increased risk compared to usual care for these infants. You know, you guys are making a fuss about nothing. The bioethical community takes sides. You know, dramatic letters are written to the New England Journal and published with numerous signatures. So these are the guys on the left is the two columns of people who, high and mighty bioethicists who say this study was okay. On the right, two columns of prominent bioethicists who say the study in particular the consent was unethical. It's interesting to look at the lists. There's a lot more people involved in the research enterprise on the left. There are a lot more MDs on the left, which is very interesting to me. I would think that I guess I see the consent as a problem, and it seems to me that clinicians, I would hope that their sensitivity and sensibility would be such that, you know, they would figure out this to be a problem. But in this case, the MDs like the study in the bioethics community, and, you know, look on the other side, it's all JDs and PhDs and a few MDs. Very interesting. So, and then finally, a suit is filed against the study investigators and against the individual members of the IRB that approved the study at UAB, who are all individually named in the suit. I could very easily have been one of those names. It just happened to be an IRB meeting that I wasn't at. And the charge was that they picked out several infants who sustained neurological harm and one infant who sustained severe retinopathy. And they said these infants were harmed by the study, because of the study. And that case reached the Alabama Supreme Court in October of 2015, and a ruling was issued on behalf of, that favored the defendants. And a lot of people said, well, you know, so the support study has been exonerated, but that was not a legitimate conclusion to draw from the judge's verdict, because what the judge said was, you plaintiffs have not successfully shown that the bad results that your infants sustained were due to things that happened in the study specifically versus prematurity. You know, what happened to your infants happened to many infants with prematurity, and you can't show that it was probably the study that did this and not the underlying condition. So that's all that the judge concluded. So they didn't have a negligence case because they couldn't show that harm had come from the intervention. But that, you know, that doesn't necessarily exonerate the study from the standpoint of either the consent form or from the research design. And the question I would ask you all, and I think the consent form, for purposes of this talk or this session, I would want it to be a separate issue. And I would ask you all about the design of the study. Was the design of this study ethical?
I think it was definitely fun. I mean, this whole idea that the standard of care was this wide range is a perfectly valid scientific question of, well, actually, should the range be narrower? Is there a reason that it should be 85 to 90 or 90 to 95? I mean, it's a completely valid scientific question. I have absolutely no problem with the study at all. That study is perfect.
So there's a valid scientific question to be answered here. Oops. I agree. From the fact that that's a valid scientific question, does it follow that the design of the study was ethical or correct or proper? What do you guys think? But before I tell you what I think.
I had a premature infant during that time, not here, but I just can't divorce myself from that. So, you know, I would, like, I might have signed that consent form, but if it was a different consent form, I probably wouldn't have signed it. You know what I mean? If there was any chance.
If the consent form had accurately reflected
Right,
what was really going on.
I would have signed it as a mother, you know, situation. So, like I said, I might feel differently if I was in a situation.
Was it ethical to well, let me ask the question I'm interested in especially is designing the study with these two arms the way it was designed. Was that the right thing to do? I looked at this study in 2013 when the thing hit the fan. My immediate question was, why was there not a standard of care arm in this study? You know, if they're going to have a low range, a high range, why not also have a usual care arm in which neonatologists make individualized decisions about what the O2 sat is going to be? And the more I thought about it,
Too expensive.
well, I mean, it might have been too expensive. It might have been more expensive, correct? The more I thought about it, the more I said to myself, well, if this is the question they're asking, why don't they just have a low O2 arm and a standard of care arm? Why not just do that? That makes much more sense to me. I mean, you are clearly increasing the risk of a potential risk to some of your subjects if you're arbitrarily randomly assigning them to a low range and a high range. Why not do the comparison with a usual care arm, even if it's going to be harder to, even if you're going to have to do the study longer and have more subjects. I would argue that it needed to be designed that way and that this was not the way to design it. And I think the other problem is the composite endpoint. I mean, you've got your interventions are sort of going in two different directions for the components of that composite endpoint. And, you know, what's a clinician, what is a research participant, what's a mother going to make of death or severe retinopathy? This study should have been powered to detect death as a separate endpoint. You know, for most, most mothers are going to, death is going to be worse than retinopathy, even if the retinopathy is severe. It's that composite endpoint is not something. The two things are too dissimilar.
When can you detect the retinopathy?
I do not know the answer to that question.
While it's still.
I'm not going to.
I had the same thought that you had, but retinopathy is a much more common outcome than death, and I haven't done the calculations. It may be infeasible to power a study like this to detect death when you think that this is going to be small.
Well, that would, maybe that's what they thought.
And the power that they had was obviously adequate to detect a larger than expected death. So
right.
A lot of times that's the way these studies are designed. You suspect a small difference, power it not to detect that, but maybe to detect a bigger than expected difference. And I mean, it seems to me that you'd want to walk away from this study knowing what the trade-offs are. So if the study wasn't adequately powered at the end, think that you were going to know, I'm preventing 30 cases of retinopathy for every death I'm preventing, and that's actually probably a reason to trade off, and that should be standard of care, then probably weren't going to end the day in a better position scientifically or now. Because again, I think that positive endpoint by itself doesn't make a lot of sense. It makes more sense as a trade-off.
Mm-hmm. A trade-off is kind of what it is, and I think if you combine, that's what makes it problematic to combine the two things. It certainly is going to make it hard for a subject to sort of know what's going on here. What.
Again, that may be an easier way to say it when they were actually doing, and it sort of sounds bad, but I mean, in effect, you can't have a primary endpoint of retinopathy because one of the trade-offs is death, and you can't say you're powering for death if you're actually not. If your hypothesis is a 3% difference in death, and that would mean you had to have 100,000 people in the trial, then this may just be a pragmatic way of saying it.
So what do you think about the argument that perhaps the arms should have included a standard of care arm somehow?
I think that's totally bogus. I think that the way you described it of, well, the neonatologist knows, well, his organs are doing good, then we can just dial down the oxygen a little bit. That's completely non-evidence-based. And that's the reason we do the studies, because we don't know these things.
Well, we don't know that individualization is beneficial, but we don't know that it's not beneficial either. And arguably, what the study showed was that it probably is beneficial.
Yeah, but we do this all the time with antibiotics for upper respiratory infection. You randomize to get antibiotics or don't get antibiotics. A third arm with whatever the clinician's gestalt is about whether or not you really need them.
I would argue that's different. I mean, an upper respiratory infection is not a serious problem. I mean, death and severe retinopathy, these are serious problems, and things need to be done a little more carefully, not treat something that needs to be treated in the right way when it's that serious.
But I think the trial's done on a fairly homogeneous group of patients who I don't think you can sort of say arbitrarily, we think that the neonatologists were going to know magically which one needed which. I mean, that's what the study was designed to answer.
I think, no, it wasn't designed to answer that question. It was designed to answer the question whether a uniform low O2 range would give you a better trade-off than the higher range that people were actually using. And the fact that people were using the higher range and that there was such a range does suggest that in fact there was individual variability that neonatologists were successfully detecting because they were using low O2 ranges in infants who could sustain that and trying to avoid retinopathy where they could, but clearly they weren't always using low O2 ranges to prevent retinopathy because they felt compelled to go to the higher ranges in some cases. I mean, it seems to be that looking at just what people were doing, there is a strong prima facie case that individualization was going on and it was probably doing good. That's the argument I would make.
So, but is that the reality that the individual and the neonatologist would use the whole range, or?
No. This is the range that was seen in the spectrum of
Sure,
these infants.
But your
If you look at
hypothesis is that an individual makes a decision whether to use the higher or low range based on the child.
well, they
right?
they pick an O2 sat that they're going to
Right.
aim for.
But do they really individualize, or do most neonatologists say, I want a 95 person?
Well, that's a good question, and that's what Dr. Riggs is suggesting. We don't know the answer to that. I'm saying there may be a plausible reason to think that there is some individualization, and he's saying, heck with you, not necessarily so, and he may be right. I mean, I guess, if we had a neonatologist here or two, we might get a better answer. Now, if you look at, part of the argument that came out in the discussion of this was that if you looked at what actual individual NICUs are doing around the country, and you say, what's the average O2 sat in your little center, most of them were on the higher side of the range. And there were some that were lower, but not most. So do you have the energy for one more? So that was the defense, the criticisms. We've kind of gone through all this. So I just wanted to end by talking about a study that had nothing to do with treatment. So clinical equipoise arguably is irrelevant. This was a basic science study. The attempt was to understand bronchoprotection and bronchodilation that you get from deep breathing if something happens to stimulate you to have bronchospasm. And so that how that works was not well understood. Could it have to do by certain ganglionic nerves in the lung? These nerves are filtered through parasympathetic ganglia, and there's a nitrous oxide is a transmitter. And we can study perhaps the function of these nerves by exposing subjects to an agent that blocks transmission through these ganglia. And the agent is hexamethonium. And hexamethonium, so they designed this study, inhaled hexamethonium versus placebo in concert with deep breathing and an agent methacholine that stimulates bronchospasm. And then they're going to do spirometry and see to what extent bronchospasm is severe or less severe, and maybe what effect the deep breathing had. And, was there a difference if those ganglia were blocked compared to if they were not blocked? And what do we know about hexamethonium? So there's several studies. I mean, not a huge number, but hexamethonium's been used in a number of inhalation studies, and 20 subjects exposed to it have had no adverse effects. And the lit search back to, through the, however far PubMed goes, back through the early mid-60s, basically gives you this picture. So this looks like a pretty safe agent. Maybe there's some risk in exposing a healthy volunteer to hexamethonium, but it doesn't look like it's going to be a major risk. I mean, nothing bad has happened before. So this risk ought to be acceptable. So the study is done, and one of the subjects actually develops, I think she developed ARDS, and died within a few days. Horrible thing. And then it turns out that if you go back before PubMed, hexamethonium had been used in a different form in the treatment of hypertension, And in literature between 1950 and 1970, some patients who'd been on hexamethonium for the treatment of blood pressure had developed very serious pulmonary pathology. These had all not inhaled it. They'd gotten it in a different way, and it had taken a lot of exposure before they developed their serious pulmonary pathology. But clearly, if the investigator who looked into hexamethonium at Hopkins had looked a little more deeply into the literature, maybe the consent form for this study would have looked a bit different than it did. Hexamethonium actually might have been thought to confer risks that clearly the investigator didn't know about. On the other hand, if you look at literature searches that people do when they're designing their research, most of them use PubMed. Most of them don't mine the literature back into the early part of the 20th century. What the investigator did was effectively, standard of care. To use a word Dr. Riggs doesn't like. I mean, he met the standard that researchers generally meet. Now, I think this was a tragic event. I mean, I think, we can argue about whether the literature search should have been more complete. I mean, maybe it should have been, but certainly what the investigator did wasn't out of the range of what people generally do. It was a tragic outcome. Bad things happen in research. Was there an ethical issue here? I'm not sure that there was. But the question that I think this study raises for our purposes is we don't have the conceptual tool of clinical equipoise to help us here. When we're designing trials in which healthy volunteers are going to be subjected to risks, how should we think about what's an acceptable risk in that situation? I mean, let's say the investigator had known about the previous hexamethonium bad pulmonary stuff in hypertension patients. Would it have been ethical to subject a healthy volunteer to hexamethonium for purposes of this physiology study? And it's a relatively small group of subjects, but none of them had a problem.
These people were only getting it once or twice, and all the people who had problems in the past have been getting it more chronically.
They've been getting it in a different. I think they've been getting it IV. I think they got it IV, and they've been getting it for a longer period of time. We go back to that net risk test that doesn't use clinical equipoise. You can say, well, how important was the knowledge to be gained? Arguably, this is a less sort of path-breaking physiological knowledge type of study than some others might be. Maybe that would be a point in favor of less risk should be imposed since the knowledge is not earth-shakingly important that we're going after, maybe. On the other hand, lots of people have inhaled this without a problem. It doesn't seem like a huge amount of risk you're subjecting somebody to, even if we know that in another mode of administration for a long period of time, people have had a problem. I think that this whole issue is a little more nebulous, a little more difficult, a little harder to sort of get your head around than the treatment arms that need to have some relationship to what we usually do. And the way that people have sort of gone about thinking about this, I mean, one way has been, what do we allow people to, what kinds of risks do we normally feel happy with people subjecting themselves to in normal life? If somebody routinely, subjects themselves to the risk of, playing tackle football or, riding a motorcycle, what's the risk of that? If we can somehow compare that kind of risk to what we might subject a healthy volunteer to, well, maybe risks on that level wouldn't be a problem. If somebody wants to, do something for science and advance the growth of human knowledge, isn't that kind of a noble sentiment? And should that person not be permitted to subject themselves to some risk? But maybe, maybe there should be a limit. Maybe there should be some limit. I mean, we don't want people immolating themselves, right? What about the Barry Marshall kind of studies where, you drink, Barry Marshall drinks his Helicobacter to give himself Helicobacter? What about the Walter Reed studies? Walter Reed basically, his subjects were mostly volunteers, and they basically, the issue was, is yellow fever transmitted by a mosquito? So some of you were going to get bitten by mosquitoes carrying yellow fever, or that may carry yellow fever, and the rest of you were going to sort of be around yellow fever fomites and blankets and stuff like that. And several of the subjects got yellow fever and died. Is that something that research subjects should have been subjected to? Now, interestingly, people who ended up in that study, I mean, a lot of them were people who were living in Cuba and said to themselves, well, I'm going to get yellow fever anyway. This way I get it under the auspices of the U.S. Army, and I get to get the best medical care that I'm going to get anywhere. So please enroll me in your study. And, yellow fever is okay with me. I don't have an answer on this issue. I mean, I think there's something about the comparison to other activities to which people routinely allow themselves to be, to encounter risk that's probably useful when we think about this issue. But this, for me, is a much harder issue than patients in whom we're testing treatments for which something like clinical equipoise, even if whether we call it that or not, seems important. Thoughts?
Well, if we don't subject our participants to some risk, they're really hard to have any studies.
Correct, absolutely.
Healthy.
Research is risky. We can't get away from that. We can't take a stance that says nobody can be subjected to any risk.
And it seems like a study like this really tragic result, but it's hard to prevent that.
I tend to agree.
So if the risk is no more than driving, for instance, in Birmingham,
Right.
which is that's pretty high risk, but everybody does it, I think that's reasonable.
Yeah. Now, what if it's the risk of skydiving or?
Yeah. Well.
But maybe for the knowledge is important enough. Maybe the risk of people do subject themselves to the risk of skydiving. Well, thank you all. That was fun.